And I think I chose this opening slide rather well, because as I look out the window, the weather I'm experiencing outside is a pretty good match for what's shown here. Um, I hope it's a little bit brighter wherever you may be. I propose to talk for a little over 35 minutes, and I'd like to share some perspectives and insights from the work that I do with senior teams and answer any questions if that's going to be possible. What I have to say is in two parts. The first is I'd like to share an approach to profiling the dynamics of senior teams, supported by a few slides that highlight how different leadership systems impact how a business can scale and directly impact enterprise value. And part two is what to do about it. So to manage flow, I suggest we have two Q&A sessions, one after the first part and the second towards the end. Now, having said that, technology has given us something of a gift. So this webinar is being streamed across different platforms, and the functionality of the platforms is inevitably different. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you can use the chat channel on YouTube to pop questions in, and I'll address them in either of the two Q&A sessions. And for those of you watching this LinkedIn live on LinkedIn, ironically, there's no chat channel. So this is why I've included my email address at the bottom of each slide that you'll see in a moment, so that if you have a thought or an idea that comes to mind that you'd like clarifying, or a question you just want to ask, just send me a short email. It's clunky, I know, but the best solution I could think of when I learned about this in terms of how to manage the technology's limitations. Anyway, before we get going, just a few quick words about me, for those who don't know me, and why I've become so focused on the subject of senior leadership teams. So I actually started my career working as an analyst in the chairman's office of one of the country's biggest family firms at the time. And I spent my days inside spreadsheets, analysing mergers and acquisitions. I enjoyed the work, but what really caught my attention was what the numbers didn't explain. On paper, many businesses looked remarkably similar, whilst in reality, their performance was often wildly different. And I wanted to understand why. And that question, why, shaped everything that followed for me. I moved into roles focused on how organizations actually work day to day, how decisions get made, how senior teams operate, and why some businesses consistently deliver whilst others stalled, despite having good strategies and very capable people. The real light bulb moment came for me during the turnaround of a biotech business that was in crisis. What changed performance was not strategy alone. It was the redesign of the senior leadership team and how it worked together. And as the leadership system changed, the business scaled from 3.5 million to over 35 million in just under 3 years. That experience fundamentally shaped the work that I do today and informs what I wrote about in my book, which launched last year, Lighting the Blue Touch Paper. So today, I help turn groups of talented, experienced people into senior leadership teams that operate at an enterprise level by making better decisions, pulling in the same direction, and driving results across the business. I work with leaders to build teams which investors trust and that businesses can scale behind in order to maximize enterprise value at exit. And it's very much my experience that leadership is not about individual heroics. It's about the leadership system. Managers work in the system that's applied. Leaders work on the system that's designed. And when the system's designed well, everything lifts. Which brings me to where we'll start today. And I'd like to begin by just sharing an incredibly simple home truth, or what's sometimes referred to as a blinding flash of the obvious that applies to all businesses. Namely, if you want to change the direction and trajectory of the business, there's no more powerful lever to do so than the senior leadership team. It's not strategy decks, it's not technology, and good grief, it's certainly not organizational charts. The senior leadership team, the SLT, sets strategy, shapes how decisions are made, how priorities are set, and how energy flows through the organization. And make no mistake, the SLT's behavior and how it carries itself sets the tone for culture, trust, and performance. Yet, in many businesses, the SLT is the least examined, least challenged, and least intentionally designed part of an organization. Many assume that once roles are defined, titles are assigned, and reporting lines are clear, that the act of leadership will take care of itself. The reality is, structure creates positions, not behaviors. As a consequence, the SLT exists on paper, but how it actually operates, how it makes those decisions, how it operates within accepted norms of behavior, and even overall direction that it sets, a kind of left implicit, assumed, and very ambiguous. So my talk today is about addressing that, and in particular, how to create a high-performing SLT which acts as a genuine force multiplier. Because when a high-performing senior team knows itself and is aligned, clarity cascades, and the SLT can then assume responsibility for its collective work, and it will operate a management execution where decisions made actually stick. And because a shared language and ways of working exist in multiple management conversations, the trade-offs are understood and the organization moves with confidence. That's the system. By contrast, when the senior team is unclear of its identity and purpose, and or misaligned and allows confusion to spread, messages fragment, execution slows, lines are drawn, and politics fills the gaps. And we all know this. This isn't some kind of wild, abstract idea. It shows up every day in how fast work moves, how confident people feel, and how willing they are to speak up, take ownership, and act with responsibility. So there's no doubt that the SLT is a multiplier for the good and the bad on turning vision into reality and making it happen across the organization. So before we jump into the nuts and bolts of transforming the performance of an SLT, I'd like to take a moment to introduce the Lake Wobegon effect, which is a remarkably common condition where we think we are better than we are. So there was a gentleman, John Cannell, who completed his work in the US education sector back in 1987. And he did so by asking a number of questions, which by way of example, he got students to rate their ability to get along with others. And over 60% rated themselves as belonging in the top 10%. Interestingly, 94% of university professors say they're doing a better job than their average colleague. And so it goes on. Our illusions of superiority are so widespread that a psychologist named it the Lake Wobegon effect, which is taken from a writer, American writer, Garrison Keillor, who had a famous radio show featuring the fictional town of Lake Wobegon, where all women are strong, all men are good looking, and all children are above average. Dare I say, in senior leadership teams, the same logic quietly applies. Ask any individual director how effective the SLT is, and their first answer runs along lines of pretty strong, better than most, not perfect, but we're performing. And yet the evidence elsewhere tells a different story. Decisions are slow, endlessly revisited, accountability is blurred, functional priorities trump enterprise outcomes, and strategy drifts between meetings, and the CEO carries more weight than the system can sustain. During the first quarter of 2025, so a year ago, when I was doing research for my book that I was writing, Lighting the Blue Touch Paper, here we go, ta-da! I was struck by the lack of readily available statistics and evidence-based insight on how well SLTs actually perform. That said, two stand out. First is, from a study by McKinsey's, 8% of senior executives think that their SLT is effective. That means 92% certainly think it's not. The second stat was over 50% of executive teams are unclear how their collective work adds value to the business. That was from the Center for Creative Leadership, a very interesting organization based in the States. But that research done in 22-23 is also backed up by research more recently done by the likes of Gartner and Deloitte. The Lake Wobegon effect is not arrogance. Yeah, let's be clear, it's a blind spot. Most senior teams are assessed from the inside by the people who helped set them up or inherit the system. They benchmark themselves more often than not against the effort, intent, and activity which they go through, not against the outcomes, pace, or enterprise value creation. So that creates a very dangerous gap. The team believes it's operating at a higher level than it actually is. And so performance plateaus feel like external headwinds rather than any internal design flaws. So underperformance becomes normalized because no one thinks that they are the problem, which is why I often say senior leadership teams are rarely underperforming because of talent. They're underperforming because they're under-designed. And until a team explicitly defines what good looks like at an enterprise level, clarifies decision rights, roles, rhythms, and benchmarks itself against observable behaviors and outcomes, and invites an external mirror rather than only listen to an internal echo, it will continue to believe it's above average, whilst value is quietly leaking out of the business. So to support that bold assertion, let's take a moment to examine how leadership causes value to leak away in a business. So I'm just going to run through a list of some fairly typical issues and their symptoms and their consequences that I find myself facing into in the work that I do. So let's start with misalignment and what it actually creates. Duplication, slow execution, the most obvious symptoms. When larger or more mature SLTs are not aligned, functional leaders hedge and protect themselves instead of committing to an enterprise decision. And inevitably, decisions are revisited and momentum drains away, costing time and money. Poor decisions do not disappear. They simply get averaged out. Bad calls equal good ones. Risk is neither embraced nor avoided, just muddled through. Over time, this results in mediocrity by design. Initiatives are launched, then quietly abandoned. Strategic priorities drift as attention moves elsewhere. Growth opportunities are identified, but not acted on. And the organization carries the cost without capturing any of the upside. Of course, the most visible of symptoms of malaise is something that provokes a very strong emotional reaction in many. Those unproductive meetings. Typically, around 15% of senior leadership time is wasted in unproductive meetings, according to Bain. If you do the maths on a 6-person SLT, on salaries alone, the lost time that can easily exceed 135k a year before accounting for any opportunity cost that's associated with that unproductive time. Meetings become places where information is shared, not decisions made. And when dysfunction is tolerated, and this one's probably the most insidious, trust is eroded. When challenge feels unsafe, silence becomes the default. Risk aversion rises and innovation stalls. Talented people disengage, not dramatically, but quietly. Some commentators refer to this as the quiet resignation. Another major consequence is a failure to cascade strategy. It's estimated that up to two of three people do not understand a business's strategy and why their team does what it does and how it contributes to the greater whole. Not because it hasn't been written down, but because it hasn't been translated into priorities, decisions, and trade-offs in a language that means anything to anybody outside of those who crafted the strategy paper. As a result, execution fails not through resistance, but because of ambiguity. And then finally, there's the stuff we all know about, and which is only all too common, which is when silos and politics take hold, functions protect territory and resource, leaders optimize their areas, and the enterprise view is lost. Agility slows, culture hardens, and change becomes so much harder than it really needs to be. All of those symptoms all belong to the same underlying design issue. And when the SLT underperforms, the business bleeds. And the thing is, and this really is the thing, it bleeds, often slowly, often invisibly, but relentlessly, which brings us to a very blunt realization that the fish rots from the head. It's a rather quaint French expression, but it's very clear. And to be clear, it's not about blame, it's about responsibility. And that responsibility is vested in leadership, which is a collective term when applied to senior leadership teams. Senior leadership behavior ripples through the entire organization, which is why investors pay such close attention to it. So let's dive in and seek to understand the dynamics of a senior leadership team and the different forms that an SLT can take. Now, I know there's a lot on this slide. So you probably want to take a screen grab or screenshot here. Excuse me, we'll refer back to it later. But by way of a quick explanation, this table summarizes 5 broad types of SLT and sets out how they operate, behave, and perform. It's structured like a maturity grid that ranges from innocence to excellence. And so let's just take a moment and just walk through it. At the far left sits the support team, best characterized by a single central figure, individual, where decisions bottleneck at the very top. Meetings focus on updates and firefighting, and blame and excuses consequently dominate. The business is dependent on just a few individuals, perhaps just 2 or 3, and it's very, very fragile as a result. Next along is, beg your pardon, is the advisory team, where there's discussion, lots of it, but little development. The dynamic is participation without accountability. Polite talk replaces traction. Unfortunately, learned helplessness becomes the norm as decision-making authority remains with just one person. It feels collaborative, but nothing really happens. It's a talking shop. And to be clear and very blunt, the MD CEO is not getting anything like the best from what his or her people can contribute. Then we see the functional team. Each leader works to optimize their own area. Some coordination, but weak alignment, short-term tactical forces. Culture shaped by compliance rather than ownership, and silos, very common. Again, being blunt, this is a group often made up of talented, experienced people, but you can't call it a team. Indeed, this is one of the more frequent mistakes I see in operation, which is to equate functional strength and excellence with enterprise cohesion and performance. Quite the opposite. But next along is the collaborative team, where there's some clear norms. There's some defined decision rights, and constructive challenge is expected. Alignment begins to drive both strategy and culture. There's some blanks and there's some holes, but the organization is and feels joined up, and the mood is very much a work in progress. And at the far right sits the enterprise leadership team. Radical candor, Kim Scott's concept, robust debate that doesn't leave bruises on people, is in full flow, as constructive conflict is the order of the day. Strong, capable people holding roles in the SLT, but the key point is that leadership is distributed throughout the firm, as leaders are intent on leaders developing leaders, where decisions are taken closest to the point of action. A leadership system is in place and growth becomes self-sustaining. The flywheel is turning. And this is where investors see least risk and are most willing to pay for a premium. As mentioned before, senior leadership behavior ripples through the organization. It shapes how decisions are made, how people behave, and how fast value is created, which leads to the question, how intentionally have you designed how your SLT turns leadership operating as a system into value? Investors, buyers, and acquirers don't just look at the numbers. When they look at a business, they take a particularly close look at how leadership works, how it's manifest, because leadership quality determines execution risk. And execution risk is always, always priced. So hopefully you can see from this visual, and I won't labor it, that the influence of the SLT and how it can act as a force multiplier, leveraging the leadership behavior that it promotes. By intentionally moving to the right, you increase the impact of turning leadership into value. Now, you can look at all this and quickly say, I recognize this somewhere on there. That's the easy part. The hard part is being honest about where you really sit. When you're in a team, up to your eyes with everything that needs to be done, it's very difficult to see your own blind spots. People avoid awkward conversations, protect their patch, or assume everyone else sees things the same way. I suggest that's where an external facilitator, armed with some diagnostics and measurable tools, can really help. They don't have history, status, or politics to manage. Their job is simply to hold up the mirror and ask the questions the team would normally dodge. And without that independent challenge, the spectrum that I was showing you a moment ago is purely descriptive. With that challenge, the spectrum and the implications that it highlights moves on from being just a diagnostic and something much more developmental. So here's the thing. All too often, everything that I'm saying about the realities of an underperforming senior team is realized too late. And it's usually after a business has entered a sales process. As I progressed my research on the book during 2025, I had several conversations with both sellers and buyers that particularly focused on how senior teams are reviewed and critically how they're valued. So going back to the SLT spectrum, let's consider how it all translates into value, particularly when it comes to the business end of how a valuation is arrived at. So on the left-hand side of the spectrum, businesses routinely attract discounts of up to 30%, sometimes more. There's one or two instances I heard of which were actually higher than that, purely because of the functioning or lack of it of the senior leadership team. On the right-hand side, enterprise level SLTs, genuinely led, enterprise-led teams command premiums of 10, perhaps as much as 20% over whatever the multiple of earnings would imply. The critical thing is the difference is not intent, it's behavior. And when it comes down to how much money finds its way into your pocket, what steps can the SLT take to maximize enterprise value? The quality of performance of your senior team directly impacts the price that others will pay for your business. So I'll just take a pause there for some questions and see if any have come in. I think I've got one. Oh, no, it's just somebody saying who they are and where they're dialing in from. So, hi, Aru. Let's just check my phone for if anybody's actually sent an email. If not, we'll move on. Ooh. No, I thought I had something there from YouTube, but not the case. But just to clarify, because I've had questions about this in the past, that investor's evaluation is usually whatever multiple of cash flow, etc., that they come up with, plus or minus cash or debt, to arrive at a number. the line at an angle is the valuation discount that is used, or premium that may be applied, depending upon the condition of the senior leadership team that's uncovered. Yep, got a question saying, do you have a step-by-step process on how to turn this vicious cycle around? Well, that's the second half of what I'm about to go into, so we'll cover that. I've got a couple of slides which help illustrate the process that I use. Okay, let's just crack on. I'll just have a quick sip of water. And let me just pick up the thread again by saying that at the very beginning, I said that SLTs matter. And when I say that, you know, it usually provokes a very knowing yawn as everybody nods along, because it's such a blinding flash of the obvious. It's one of those statements. But it comes with an uncomfortable truth. There's a well-documented leadership paradox that the teams most confident in their effectiveness are often the least accurate in their self-assessment. It's the Lake Wobegon effect. The confidence capability gap is very common. Easy to spot in others, isn't it? But much less frequently does leadership see it in themselves. And at the risk of being indelicate, most leadership teams are very good at holding others to account. Functions, departments, delivery teams, you know, marketing, sales campaigns, conversion rates, finance function, account turnaround times, supply chain, OTF, and you know, in-stock positions, etc. Usually there's no shortage of KPIs to inform judgment. But senior teams, remarkably, are less disciplined at asking one simple question. How effective are we collectively at doing our job? And uniquely, there's an absence of data. And so, inevitably, the blind spots become widespread. And one example of how this blind spot develops is because challenging peers of equal status can feel impolite, if not downright awkward, or conflict is avoided as calling out underperformance is seen or feels political, and so drift creeps in, is tolerated, and becomes the norm. And this is the key point. SLT underperformance rarely ever shows up as a crisis. It shows up as drift. And we've all seen that drift carries a heavy price come the day you want to sell a business. And you can see the pain and agonies that it is to live with whilst the SLT drifts from the earlier slides. So what's to be done? Let me just try and get back on track with the slides here. This is where I use an SLT operating system canvas. Invariably one of the very early steps that I get involved in with clients. I refer to this kind of template or something very close to it, depending on the nature and circumstances of the workplace. But critical thing for me is one page, a single page framework that defines how the senior team leads, how it decides, how it communicates, how it executes. And it connects intent to impact through behaviors, rhythms, and practices. To that end, the power of the OS canvas is not what it adds, it's what it removes, namely misunderstanding, so ambiguity, decisions being revisited constantly, and the politics after meetings, you know, the expression that, the real discussion starts after the decision's been taken and the real litigation that goes on around decisions. So the OS canvas works to create clarity upfront on decision making, authority, behaviors, energy flow, and how leadership is visible to others in the organization. And then the next step is actually measuring how leadership's practiced. Developing your own SLT performance dashboard allows teams to see, are we actually doing the right things and are we doing them well? It turns instinct into evidence. And this really matters because leadership teams are often opinion rich and evidence poor. The dashboard forces prioritization. It surfaces what really matters and what doesn't. Now, an SLT dashboard takes a bit of effort to design. I'm not saying it's easy, but the best things in life rarely are. Because this dashboard deliberately brings together 3 different types of data. The first is how the team feels it's operating. So that qualitative human reality of leadership, trying to pick up some of those nuances. And I've got some diagnostics that I've developed to help capture that. The second is the leading indicators that show whether the right things are actually happening day to day in terms of the effects throughout the organization. And third, the lagging results that confirm whether those efforts are actually paying off. For some teams, dare I say, it takes a bit of courage to start collecting this kind of data because it removes the comfort of opinion and replaces it with evidence. What the dashboard usually reveals is not failure, but unfinished work, which in itself is an all-important mindset shift to make. That shift becomes real once the data is reviewed regularly. So conversations become more focused, progress becomes more visible, and small improvements begin to compound. And over time, that rhythm creates a healthy momentum that turns leadership improvement into a continuous shared discipline rather than a one-off initiative, which is very much the graveyard of nearly most, if not all, change programs. In pulling together my book, Lighting the Blue Touch Paper, I talk about 6 ingredients that show up again and again in leadership teams that really work well. I'm not going to labor all 6, but this is the mix that tends to make the difference. First up, clear ways of working built on real human connection. Psychologically safe environments where people can be vulnerable and speak up. Second, shared goals that give people a common line of sight between decisions and actions. Next is roles that are understood and fit together inside a simple operating framework that clarifies handoffs and boundaries between different people. Plans are developed that link strategy to what actually gets done and managed and executed. And there is a steady rhythm of execution that drives follow through throughout the business. All of that in an environment that's been created where people feel engaged, trusted, and able to think and say what they think. None of that is remotely controversial. It all sounds perfectly reasonable, if not bland. The most interesting question is this, though. It's not which one's missing or weaker than you'd like. It's where you're really kind of stretched and not really optimizing. So which one of those are you letting yourself down on? Or perhaps it's two or three within the team. Most SLTs don't struggle because everything's broken. They struggle because one or two of these elements are thin, and the rest of the system's kind of making up for it and working its way around the gaps which open up. So when norms are fuzzy, politics creeps in. When roles aren't clear, decisions slow down or float upwards onto the top man or lady's desk. And when there's no execution rhythm, strategy starts to look good on slides and goes absolutely nowhere in practice. A performance dashboard for the SLT that provides evidence, that spotlights gaps, and what needs to be worked on is the best antidote to the conditions that I've just described. So, key thing about a high-performing senior leadership team is that they identify with and commit to the enterprise, not just their own functions. They think of themselves as a first team, and that shows up in how they work together. They model the behavior they expect to see elsewhere. And they have a very low tolerance for ambiguity and take responsibility for culture and talent rather than leaving it to a system or chance. They pay attention to the so-called soft stuff, trust, safety, relationships, because they know it's what drives hard results. And if something feels awkward or difficult to measure, it's usually a sign that it matters. These teams lead beyond function. They align around a shared purpose, give others a space and confidence to act, and hold themselves accountable as a group rather than as individuals protecting their patch. Intentional leadership is their calling card, and they practice it religiously to develop leaders within their own reporting lines so that the whole business operates as though it's on the front foot. A well-designed dashboard makes this visible. It shows leadership is really landing in terms of execution speed, trust, clarity, and accountability. Once leadership can be seen, it can be improved. It stops being personal and starts being professional. And this is where it all comes together. Strong SLTs reduce execution risk by making leadership visible at multiple points in the business, increase predictability, and build investor confidence, attracting a premium at sale in all likelihood and further opportunity for those participants on a bigger stage in the future. Leadership maturity is a genuine commercial asset, not just a nice, warm, fluffy idea. It's also very evident that when it's not there, particularly if rhetoric and management by exhortation is used to fill the void without any of the supporting processes, systems, and enabling behaviors and culture in place. Such posturing invariably makes what does not exist to appear more lacking than it is, and sadly backfires. And so to close, I'd sum all this up with a second home truth, which when it comes to turning leadership into value, quite simply, you reap what you sow. So let me finish by outlining a choice about how leadership's exercised in your organization. Leadership's often viewed as belonging to an individual, and the focus of much teaching and materials on leadership development focus on influence and impact and the ability to inspire others. The benefits of leadership accelerate when leadership is applied as a collective term at a senior team level to secure alignment on enterprise focus. And performance really lifts off when leadership operates at a system level where everybody has a contribution to make, engage, drive results, and work on being better tomorrow, next week, next month. So as spotlighted earlier, the senior team has seen where it all comes together as the force multiplier for organizational performance. Now you can let your leadership design evolve by default, shaped by habits, personalities, and whatever forces happen to shout loudest at the time. Or you can step back and design it deliberately, in line with what the business needs for the future and how you want it to be, rather than necessarily how it's always worked. That choice has consequences. Teams operating with their heads down quietly erode value. Those working in silos burn time and energy without much beyond their function to show for it. High-performing teams, on the other hand, build enterprises underpinned by leadership systems that people, investors, are willing to pay a premium for. After all, they want a machine that is successful at running itself. And to that end, the real question actually isn't so much what sort of business do you run, it's what senior leadership team are you choosing to build, and do you know how much enterprise value that choice is costing you right now? So if all of this has stirred up some uncomfortable thoughts about your own senior team's setup and performance, a good starting point to address the challenges you're experiencing is with what I call a facilitated base camp workshop. It reveals a clear, shared view of where the team honestly sits and why it gives you, and it also gives you a practical way to talk about it and plan for what needs to change and the future likely return on investment of doing so. So I'm a great advocate of just pausing play, putting a foot on the ball, and take a moment to reassess and reset before going again. So I hope the material shared this morning stimulating, helpful, and that's really all I have to say at this particular point in time, unless there's any other questions which may have come in. So let me just check my email and what's in the chat channel. But sadly, nothing's come in. So hopefully all is good. All has been seen. All has been heard, I hope. And I hope that all kind of helps shine a light on something which, strangely enough, until I began to really focus on it and the conversations that I've been having with people, it really, other than one or two uncomfortable itches, there was never really a clear pattern to uncover and to discover how all these things hang together. And hopefully I've highlighted a way by which it does for you to take away today. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll just close it there. Thank you very much. I hope that was helpful.